Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to week 2. Hi again, I hope you all had a nice weekend. So we're starting off week 2, and the theme this week is identity formation, divisions, and mechanisms. So it will be about the same. We have 4 wonderful professors from different schools at USD presenting. So we'll get started here. Our first presenter is Dr. S. Fahani.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Isfahani. I'm in the Department of Economics in the School of Business. And today I'm going to be talking about AI and the division of domestic labor. I recently taught a class about gender and economic justice, which made me think about the issues of wage gap or the amount of time men and women spend on domestic tasks. And I also attended a workshop that was about the impact of technology on the division of domestic labor, which made me do a little bit of research and put this talk together for you today. So I hope you enjoy it. This is something I've been exploring recently and I'm very passionate about. So like I said, today I'm going to be talking about an interesting topic in economics, and that would be AI and the division of domestic labor. For numerous decades, maybe even centuries, women have borne a disproportionate burden of managing household labor, including domestic chores, child rearing, elder care, various other caregiving responsibilities. And despite the increasing participation of women in the paid labor force, specifically in developed countries, everywhere really across the world, but more in developed countries, the gender segregation of unpaid domestic labor has continued to persist. As we find ourselves in this era of remarkable advancements in artificial intelligence, then a question that we can potentially ask ourselves is, how does this evolution of domestic labor change with the introduction of these new technologies, and how is this going to change the things for all these jobs and household tasks that have been traditionally fallen heavily on women? For example, the introduction of AI, autonomous vehicles, delivery robots for foods and groceries, and all these sophisticated language models could potentially influence the dynamics of the domestic labor. So now, are there specific areas of household labor tasks that can benefit from the application of these emerging technologies? And what impact could this have on the gender division of household roles that we often see? I'd like to take a moment to discuss unpaid domestic work first, and the connection it has to paid work. Many of us may have encountered newspaper articles, academic research, policy papers, all addressing paid work and the related issues. What are the implications of it? How many of the current paid jobs are going to potentially be replaced by smart technologies in the near future? What would that mean? How would we support the people who are going to be losing their jobs? But surprisingly, there seems to be really limited research exploring similar consequences in the case of unpaid domestic work. As this picture shows, the picture is by Bread Women's Workshop. Unpaid work, also known as reproductive labor, is absolutely crucial. Societies cannot function without them. No paid work can truly thrive if there's no one preparing the meals, maintaining the homes, caring for children, and supporting the family members in need of assistance. Unpaid work not only holds a significant importance, but it also demands a lot of amount of time and effort. So this chart that I have here for you, the data is available for a lot of countries. I've selected a few of these countries that I thought would be interesting for showing the trends that exist in the data, but don't think that the countries I've selected only has these trends, because all of the countries that are there actually show a similar trend. So what I'm going to show you here is the total amount of paid and unpaid time that men and women spend. And on the far left, I have Canada. So the first 4 bars are Canada. And all the orange bars show men, all the blue bars show women. And then this is divided by paid work and unpaid work. So if you look at the first 2 bars on the far left, you're comparing the amount of time men spend in paid work with the amount of time women spend in paid work. And you can see the orange bar is taller than the blue bar, meaning that men spend more time outside of home for paid work in Canada. Now, if you focus on the second 2 bars for unpaid work, you can see that women actually spend more time in unpaid work. And this is Canada. Now, let's move on to India. So if you look at India, you see a similar trend. Men spend more time in paid work compared to women, and then women spend more time in unpaid work compared to men. And the gap is even larger in India than what we saw in Canada. Look at the OECD average for all of these countries. The trends are similar. Women are just spending a lot more time doing unpaid domestic work, and men are doing more time doing paid work. And when you combine the total amount of work that men and women are doing for both paid and unpaid, pretty much across all countries, you see that women are generally doing more work. Because even though women are doing some of the paid work, they're still doing a substantial proportion of the unpaid work. So the combined paid and unpaid work for women is larger than what we see for men. So there's this recent study their study focuses on UK and Japan. And they conduct an expert survey with a particular focus on exploring the possibility of robots assuming certain household tasks. Particularly, those are that less glamorous and perhaps more laborious in nature. They categorize different household and caregiving responsibilities into about 17 categories that you see in this picture. Then they approach experts working in the field of smart technologies, and specifically those who work with domestic automation in both UK and Japan. And they pose several questions to them, including one about the projected proportion of the time that could be saved in the nation for each given domestic task, each one of the 17 categories, like cooking, dishwashing, cleaning, for the next 10 years. Their time frame is for the next 10 years. The question was framed based on the existing technologies. So they're not taking into account, well, they already take into account the technologies that we currently have, like dishwashers or washing machines that are already in use. From the bar chart displaying the results of the survey, 2 significant observations can be made. First is that experts anticipate a considerable level of automation across all tasks within the next 10 years, resulting in a substantial time saving for the whole household, even for tasks that involve physical childcare, which is predicted to have the lowest level of automation. Experts estimate that we can save about 20% of the time that we currently spend on these tasks with the current and future technologies that are going to be coming in. For many other household-related tasks, specifically those that are more routine, like routine chores, experts perceive a higher proportion or potential for automation. Therefore, the first key finding is that we anticipate significant automation across various aspects of domestic labor. The second thing I want you to take away from this picture is that when considering the distinction between household tasks, those are the pink and purple bars, and care tasks on the right side of the bar chart, Experts generally believe that housework, including dishwashing, cleaning, cooking, grocery shopping, is more amenable to automation compared to care-related responsibilities. This suggests that housework, which constitute unpaid work, can be automated to a significant extent, with the acknowledgement that such automation may have transformable implications for our daily lives. These findings raise numerous questions regarding the potential social consequences of automation in household tasks. As we have established, unpaid work occupies a substantial amount of time, and it plays a pivotal role in our lives. So as I previously said, there exists a significant disparity in the division of domestic work among household members, with women shouldering a larger share of responsibilities. Routine domestic tasks, which are predominantly carried out by women, are also the ones that are most amenable to automation. So in theory, considering the trajectory of automation, women would stand to gain the most if individuals and households could readily adopt these technologies. And this could potentially reduce the gender gap in domestic labor and offer time saving that disproportionately benefit women. Now, who else can benefit from these technologies? Technology's impact goes beyond just the individual that's going to be using the technology. Let me give you an example. So let's say there is a father that's using ChatGPT while at home with his son when they can't decide what to do. ChatGPT can suggest various activities to them when they encounter difficulties or they don't know what to do. Like let's say the weather is bad, they are missing ingredients for baking cookies. And they don't know how to adjust the cooking time and so on. They rely on ChatGPT. They can just ask ChatGPT what to do. They ask for assistance. And without making a call to the mom who is working outside of the house, which would have been the typical resource before ChatGPT. So this simple scenario shows you that technology not only benefits the person that's using it, but it also indirectly affects the other people that are involved. In this case, it helps the mom to stay focused and continue her work while her partner effectively manages the situation at home with the help of AI. Now, can AI help only with lowering the physical burden of domestic tasks? Well, no. One key realization is that the use of AI can result in cognitive savings as well for individuals. For instance, the technology can assist with scheduling, planning, decision-making, which can alleviate the cognitive load of these domestic tasks. The researchers propose that as the technology improves, there's a potential for cognitive offloading where individuals rely on the technology to handle aspects of managing domestic labor. So if you have like kids, they have to take classes, they have to go to their doctor appointments, you have to pick them up, drop them off. There's like a lot of planning involved. That just like between the two parents or sometimes one parent, they need to decide how to manage and how to organize all of these tasks and how to take care of them. And this takes a lot of energy for them, which can totally be saved if we can use AI to do all the planning for us. But do all women benefit? Because we said women are potentially going to be benefiting the most out of this, but is this true for all women? Not everyone has the means or access to afford and adopt these technologies. If emerging technologies come with price tags, substantial price tags, it could perpetuate across inequality, where wealthier households benefit from time saving and potentially they stop employing lower income individuals, primarily women who would be assisting them with cleaning, cooking, childcare. And as you can see, these shiny new robots might fulfill those tasks, increasing free time for wealthier households while at the same time, they lead to job loss for poorer households. So not everyone is going to benefit the same from these technologies, especially if the cost is high. Are there any other consequences aside from like this inequality that we talked about? Well, unpaid domestic work shares some similarities with paid work, like it's time consuming. It can involve repetitive and unrewarding tasks. However, it extends beyond mere work and encompasses a significant caring component. It is how people express love and build familiar relationships. If technology significantly supplants or replaces these tasks, particularly those related to caregiving, it could lead to long-term changes in domestic interactions and family dynamics. Also, given that caring nature of domestic work, individuals providing care need to possess substantial knowledge about the person that they're caring for. Like, my vacuum cleaner robot probably doesn't need to know much about me, but if there's a robot that's going to be cooking for me or cooking for my household, the robot needs to know a lot of things about our family allergies, health conditions, food preferences, so that it can do its job effectively. And this raises the question about ownership of such information and the associated risks of privacy breaches or significant loss of privacy. Consider the potential for another consequence that you can think about is the potential for surveillance and power dynamics within the household. Take the example of the smart doorbells. You might have heard of Ring. On one hand, these technologies offer convenience because they enable you to remotely access or remotely give access to people. So let's say you have someone coming to your house to fix one of your appliances. You don't even need to be at the house. You can see who's at the front door. You can let them in. You probably have other cameras. You can see them come in, do the work. Without you being there, they can come in, do the task, and leave your house. On the other hand, they possess surveillance capabilities, allowing homeowners to monitor anyone entering their household, observing family members' movements, doorstep interactions. You can listen to the conversation and everything. In situations where power imbalances exist within the family, or in cases of abusive relationships, these emerging technologies pose a significant risk when deployed in private homes. So it's important when we're considering adopting these new technologies, AI, to make our lives easier. It's really important to think about the darker consequences of these technologies as well, and just like be ready for what might come on the side of all these beauties that are going to be coming with AI to our lives. So I guess that's all I had for you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. We're just going to move right along. So once again, if you have questions or comments, we'll save those for the very end. Our next presenter is Dr. Asaro.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So nice to see you. So I'm delighted to speak to all of you today as part of our First at USD course. I love having the opportunity to meet all of you before the semester, and it's really fun to hear my colleagues speak and your future professors. I really appreciate these interdisciplinary forums that we have at USD. It's one of my favorite parts of USD. So hopefully you are able to also appreciate that once you get started this semester and have more exposure to that. I've been involved in this program since it was created in 2020, and I look forward to participating in every year. And each year, the topic changes. So when Dr. Smith and Tyrell announced the topic for this year, I wasn't sure at first what I would be speaking about. I'm a professor of Italian studies in the Department of Languages, Cultures, and Literatures. And my usual job is teaching and researching in Italian language, literature, culture, and history. I thought at first about speaking about AI and translation, which is something that I've been working on. But in the end, I opted for a different approach. I realized that there's a very important and complicated and even fun figure in the Italian literary tradition that embodies the questions that this year's humanities seminar is asking. And I'm speaking, as you can see, about Pinocchio. This story of an animate wooden puppet who becomes a human boy seems to be an especially apt departure point for a discussion of human identity and artificial intelligence. In addition, the virtually innumerable versions of the story in various mediums, languages, and time periods help us to trace our changing conceptions of and attitudes towards these issues. So today, I'll be very briefly touching on the versions represented by the images that you can see here. We have Carlo Collodi's original 1883 coming-of-age novel, written immediately after the unification of the Italian state. We have a version you probably know, Disney's highly influential, although I'll argue ultimately sanitized mid-century American cartoon, Steven Spielberg's turn of the millennium Pinocchio-esque post-apocalyptic film entitled, in fact, AI, Artificial Intelligence. And finally, Guillermo del Toro's 2022 stop-motion animated film, which is set in fascist Italy. My presentation today is going to be light on analysis. Instead, I thought I'd present some information about these stories and their contexts, and then I'll invite you to reflect upon them on your own and perhaps share some of your thoughts with me later today in discussion group. So one last framing thought before we jump in. My talk today, unlike my esteemed colleagues, which I really appreciate, by the way, is not going to directly respond to questions about AI in our present moment. But instead, I'd like to guide us in meditating on some deeper questions of humanity and identity that may better equip us in navigating our quickly changing world. Pinocchio's story, after all, calls us to question what being alive and being human actually mean, and his transition from object to human troublingly challenges the boundaries between the two. So I'm going to jump out of chronological order and begin, in fact, with this example, the American film AI, Artificial Intelligence. I think it's a good starting point because it's the first version of the story, at least of which I'm aware, to explicitly recognize Pinocchio as a form of artificial intelligence. You'll notice from the date that this movie was released at the turn of the millennium, at a time of widespread and not wholly unfounded anxieties about advancing technologies and Y2K. The protagonist of the film is David, an AI robot that is programmed to love. He's adopted by a couple, but they're soon disturbed by David's behaviors, which mimic those of a human, but are not quite there. And this is, by the way, a great example of the uncanny valley, which you'll certainly hear about from my colleagues in other disciplines. The couple finally give David away, leaving him to roam the world in this liminal state, yearning for his mother's love as dictated by his programming, but unable, due to his being a robot, to be loved in return. And just in case we in the audience missed the analogy, Spielberg adds several Pinocchio references. After David is abandoned by his family, he remembers Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio and becomes convinced that if he finds the blue fairy, he can become a real boy and earn his mother's love. At the end of the film, we're in a distant future in which humanity has gone extinct and AI robots evolved from models like David govern the earth. They communicate to David through a blue fairy animation, which you can see here in the image, and artificially reconstruct David's family from his memories. The movie closes with the projection of his mother telling him that she loves him, even though by this time his human family is long dead. The film calls into question our definition of humanity, as you can see from the tagline on the poster. His love is real, but he is not. Is David's love real if it is programmed? What differentiates the electrical impulses of a computer brain from the chemical reactions in the human brain that produce what we call love? And why is it that David passes the so-called duck test for humanity? He looks like a human and acts like a human, but his human mother is unable to love him. And how does sophisticated AI, like that represented by David, obscure the boundaries between a puppet and a real boy? So with all that floating around in your heads, we'll move right along. And I did warn you, right, that I'm going to be asking more questions today rather than answering them. But we can discuss them, as I said, later if you wish. So we'll now speak about the one that started it all. This is the 1883 children's novel, Le avventure di Pinocchio, storia di un burattino, written by Carlo Lorenzini, also known by his pen name Carlo Collodi. Collodi invented Pinocchio, and the figure became so popular that it quickly spawned what are known in Italian as Pinocchiate. Today, we might call this fan fiction, basically works by other authors involving Pinocchio and his universe. There's also an academic subfield, Pinocchiology. Collodi's novel has been a bestseller since its publication and is one of the most translated and published books of all time. But let's go back to the context of the original story, Pinocchio's birth, if you will, because it coincides with a very particular point in Italian history. Some of you may be surprised to know that as a political state, Italy, in fact, is slightly younger than California. Italy was unified as a country in 1861. However, although it was a single political entity on paper, it was apparent that a cultural and even linguistic unification, a sense of camaraderie and patriotism, would not be quickly achieved. And I'll add, by the way, that there still does not exist a monolithic Italian culture. And if you'd like to learn more about Italy's beautiful diversity, I would be very happy to see you in an Italian class at USD. In fact, a well-known quote from this era is that by the statesman Massimo d'Azeglio, who observes this: "L'Italia è fatta, restano da fare gli italiani." Italy, or we have made Italy, now we must make Italians. Now, Collodi did not set out to write a political allegory when he wrote Pinocchio. It's definitely a fantasy novel written for children. However, his context did influence him, and as Pinocchio learns how to be a contributing member of society, being a good boy and obeying his father, we can see how the parents reading alongside their children may simultaneously be learning how they may too learn to be good Italians and obey the new state. So with this in mind, let's take a look. The first thing I'd like you to see is Pinocchio's creation. Here on the screen, you can see the opening lines of the novel. "Once upon a time, there was a king," my little readers will say right away. "No, children, you are wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood." I find this to be a fascinating start because we're about to embark on this fantastical adventure with Pinocchio, and yet Collodi is shaking up our expectations by insisting on the ordinariness of the main character and his origin. In fact, the first person to come into contact with this wood, the carpenter Master Cherry, who you can see here on the left, intends to make a table leg out of it. But as he begins to work with this ordinary piece of wood, it shows off extraordinary characteristics. It yelps in pain when he cuts it and giggles as he sands it. Pinocchio seems to experience and react to sensations even as unformed material. You're likely familiar with the figure on the right, Geppetto, who is gifted the wood by Master Cherry. It is Geppetto who names Pinocchio, and even before he is fully carved, Pinocchio behaves like a human child, sticking out his tongue as soon as his mouth is formed and running away as soon as he has feet. Geppetto himself seems to immediately forget that Pinocchio is a puppet, calling him a scamp of a child, my boy, and again, wicked child. He simultaneously, however, acknowledges that Pinocchio is a puppet and Geppetto's own creation, commenting that he worked so hard to make him a nice puppet and seems to take at least partial responsibility for his creation's actions when he concludes, "I should have known better." When Pinocchio meets the blue fairy, she more clearly delineates the boundaries between object and human. Humanity, it would seem, is a reward for good behavior, as Pinocchio will cease to be a puppet and be a proper boy when he deserves it. Something strange in this passage is the Blue Fairy's allusion to a puppet's life cycle. They are seemingly mortal, as they are born as puppets, live as puppets, and die as puppets. In fact, in the original version of the novel, Pinocchio dies at the end, and Collodi only changed it after his fans, or really the parents of the children, wrote him and complained. This leaves us wondering, what exactly is the difference between being a puppet and a real boy? So let's see if we can get some insight from the conclusion of this novel. After developing a strong work ethic and taking care of his ailing father, Pinocchio wakes up one day and finds that not only he, but his whole house has transformed. As Geppetto explains, when children go from bad to good, they have the power of making things take on a bright new look inside with their families too. An odd detail is that Pinocchio's human body does not replace the puppet body. Instead, he asks where the old Pinocchio of wood is, and Geppetto indicates a large, lifeless wooden puppet propped up on a chair. The new human Pinocchio looks at it, and we are left with this kind of puzzling and trite final line: how funny I was when I was a puppet, and how glad I am now that I become a proper boy. That's the end of the novel, by the way. So we're getting ready to move on to our next example, but before I do, I'll mention that the Italian word for puppet, burattino, has the same connotations as in English: someone whose every movement is controlled by another, a conformist, a sheep. So looking at this picture again, we may ask ourselves, who is the real puppet? Was Pinocchio perhaps more like a human child when he was a disobedient toy, rather than this real boy who has learned how to conform to societal expectations to the point of a literal out-of-body experience? And again, I look forward to hearing your thoughts in discussion group. For now, we'll move right along to the version with which all of you are likely familiar. This is Disney's, you can tell what I do for a day job, 1940 animated film. I'll just mention briefly the context, as you may be able to already imagine given the date. This film was released on the brink of World War II. And in fact, the scholar Robin Allen notes that the dark themes in Disney's Pinocchio at this time of international turmoil may partially explain its initial failure at the box office. Since we're focusing today on issues of human identity, I'll move on to the transformation of Pinocchio in this version. So unlike in Collodi's version, Pinocchio begins as a real puppet, if you will, that is without consciousness. And you can see how the animators included the rounded eyes to emphasize the inanimate nature of Pinocchio's initial state. The Blue Fairy, looking kind of suspiciously like a 1930s Hollywood actress, right? She then animates Pinocchio in response to Geppetto's wish for him to become a real boy. She tells him that the final transformation will come if he proves himself to be brave, truthful, and unselfish. And Pinocchio pulls it off by the conclusion of the film, as you can see in this last image. Here I'm going to turn again to the words of Robin Allen. So Allen says that in the Disney version, we forget that Pinocchio is a puppet, and it's emphasized at the end of the film when he does become a real boy. The only thing that changes is his nose. The face remains the same, but the animated real child is a disappointment. This is just another American kid. The wooden nose, the icon of difference, has vanished, and sympathy for the hero is lost. While the Disney version is certainly a departure in many ways from Collodi's original, both then leave us with this similar feeling of disappointment when Pinocchio finally becomes quote-unquote human. We lose interest in this sanitized version of a child who seems almost inhuman by his degree of obedience, and to be more wooden, we could say, than when he was literally made out of wood. So moving right along to our last example, this is Pinocchio by the Mexican director Guillermo del Toro, and it was released by Netflix last year. Notably, since this is a stop-motion animated feature, it's the only version of the story of the puppet that is, in fact, made with puppets. And as you can see from the central transposed image on the movie poster, Del Toro is very interested in the intersections between human and puppet identities. Del Toro is famous for having a specific vision for his projects, and making artistic choices very purposefully. So I'll be using quotes from him to guide us through our brief discussion of this film. Interestingly, Del Toro recognizes a link between Pinocchio and another famous fictional figure, sometimes thought of as a pre-modern example of AI. He says, "I've always been really intrigued by the links between Pinocchio and Frankenstein. They're both about a child that is thrown into the world. They are both created by a father who then expects them to figure out what's good, what's bad, the ethics, the morals, love, life, and essentials on their own." Del Toro makes the very intriguing choice to return his Pinocchio story to its original Italian setting, but instead of the mid-19th century, he chooses the mid-20th, that is, Italy under fascism. The setting layers even more complexity on questions of humanity in the story, as it takes place at a time when basic human rights were denied and human adherents of fascism behaved in inhuman ways. The so-called Ventennio Nero, or Black 20 years between 1922 and 1943, saw the elimination by imprisonment or assassination of fascism's opposers, the censorship of the press, the suppression of women's rights, the persecution of individuals based on race and sexuality, aggressive imperialism and colonialism, and called citizens to a complete surrender to fascist ideologies at the expense of individual free thinking. This is the backdrop to Del Toro's version of the story. And as he says, blind obedience is not a virtue. The virtue Pinocchio has is to disobey. At a time when everybody else behaves as a puppet, he doesn't. So this may help us to understand why Del Toro chooses not to transform Pinocchio into a human at the end of the story. After all, while many humans in his story do not show any regard for human dignity or life, why would becoming flesh and blood be a model to follow or a symbol for having achieved something? Del Toro himself says, "To me, it's essential to counter the idea that you have to change into a flesh and blood child to be a real human. All you need to be human is to really behave like one, you know? I have never believed that transformation should be demanded to gain love." Del Toro's film is set in fascist Italy, but it was made in, and we, the audience, live in the information age, the digital age, the age of AI. Is there something that his version of the story can reveal to us specifically? How do we cope with a world in which the non-human approaches the human? How do we as humans retain our humanity? Del Toro does not give us easy answers, but he does give us an idea of where to look for them. He essentially tells us that we must do what we have started to do here today, that is to communicate with each other. In this last quote, he focuses on children, but I would argue that perhaps in this quickly moving and uncertain age, we are all children. He says, "These are times that demand from kids a complexity that is tremendous, far more daunting, I think, than when I was a child. Kids need answers and reassurances. For me, this is for both children and adults that talk to each other. It tackles very deep ideas about what makes us human." So building off Del Toro's words, I'll conclude by saying that these types of conversations with your professors and with each other, this is the core of the work that you'll be doing at USD. And before I leave you today, one last thing, I'd like to offer some suggestions for further exploration. First, if you'd like to read Collodi's novel, there's an excellent bilingual edition with the Italian and English on facing pages published by UC Press. And this is where I've taken your reading for this week. If you don't have time for that yet, I understand. Oh, sorry. If you don't have time for that yet, we have another option. This is Matteo Garrone's 2019 Pinocchio film, which is a very faithful adaptation of the novel. I, of course, highly recommend Del Toro's film on Netflix, but also the making of special titled Hand-Carved Cinema. If you haven't seen it yet, you'll get this fascinating glimpse at the puppetry behind the puppet. And finally, if you find yourself in the LA area, if someone really wants to reach me, sorry about that. We have an exhibit. It's entitled "A Real Boy: The Many Lives of Pinocchio." And this is at the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles, now until October 15th. And with that, I'll close. Thank you so much for joining me, for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Asaro. That was really magical and super interesting to learn about all the different versions. We're going to move right along to our third presenter, Dr. Blazer.
Yes, hello. Nice to see you all. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first attempt at one of these summer seminars, and so the topic was just too exciting for me to miss. And it's been great listening to the talk so far. And I really look forward to meeting some of you guys later on in the discussion section where we can talk about some of these a little bit more. So I'm in the Department of Psychological Sciences, and my area of research is actually in learning and cognition. So mostly what I'm going to be talking about today are some of the, actually it's an interesting similarity to the same questions that Dr. Asaro was just talking about, because I'm going to be asking a lot of the same questions, but from a very totally different perspective. And so you'll see how in just 1 minute. So I'm going to be talking about the human brain and whether there's really anything special about it or not. I'm not going to tell you whether there is, but I'm going to ask you whether there is, and maybe you can tell me a little bit later. Okay, and so to do this, I'm going to go back in time to start, but I'm going to go back quite a bit further than the 19th century. So we're going to go all the way back in time. You can see here to, let's see, oh no, okay. We're going to follow the spiral back. You can kind of see the time. 65 million years ago is sort of when there were dinosaurs. And if you keep going around that spiral, 250 million years ago, we're actually going to go back about 500 million years ago, or a little bit more, to the Cambrian period, or sort of the time where invertebrates and vertebrates started to branch out into all of the different life forms that we have now. And I'm going to argue that this is actually where intelligence began. This is about when the first neuron appeared, we believe. So this is where neurons started to emerge. And something else important started around this time. So I would argue, and you can argue with me later if you like, but I would argue that intelligence started about 500 million years ago, when reactions became predictions. So lots of things can react, right? You don't even have to be a living thing to react, right? You can have chemical reactions. You can have physical reactions where, you know, things mechanically move around in response to other forces. We have medical reactions. We have reflexes, right? We can all react to things, and plants can react to things, right? That's not very hard. But where it gets interesting is this box came up to highlight most species of animals. These are all animals that have come about from a common ancestor about 500 million years ago. Most of these animals share the capacity of prediction. And it turns out that prediction is actually a very useful skill. So there is a survival advantage that comes along with being able to react faster, right? Being able to react before the event actually occurs, right? So it's useful, right? If a predator comes up and bites you in the tail, it's useful to react and try to swim away. But it's more useful to see that predator off in the distance and swim away before that predator bites you in the tail, right? It's good to predict that maybe we should start moving away now instead of waiting until the actual event occurs. It's useful to taste a chemical and then to consume it because it has nutritional value, but it's more useful to smell that food off in the distance and think, oh, I should go find that food and eat it because it is likely to have nutritional value. Right? So there's a major advantage that seemed to come about evolutionarily from knowing in advance when something is going to happen. And like I said, all of these animals, including humans, fall in this very top category of chordates, who are the vertebrates, right? That includes all vertebrates, fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, everyone. We're up there with them. But in fact, we share this also with worms and snails and honeybees and some less sophisticated animals. All of us share this capacity to predict. How do we do that? Well, the simplest form of prediction is something called associative learning, right? And through associative learning, we use our neurons, and I know that you learned a little bit about these last week with Dr. Wenzel. She and I worked together. So we use these neurons to make new connections between sensory inputs and some kind of output, right? A behavior or some kind of a response. So we start out with inputs leading to outputs, but these connections can change so that new inputs can be connected to new outputs, right? And through associative learning, we can connect causes with effects. We can connect events in the world that probabilistically co-occur, right? So if two things are likely to happen together at the same time, our connections can change, these weights can change so that we can associate these two events and realize that if we see one, then we're likely to see the other one. Or if we smell one, we're likely to taste something else. If we hear something, we're likely to feel something else. So we can detect probabilities, causes and effects, and other coincidences that are likely to be important for us. And this can scale up to lead to much more sophisticated things like perceptual learning. We can learn to recognize words that belong in our language or that don't. We can engage in statistical learning where we recognize larger patterns in data. This is how we recognize objects and discriminate between a tree and a bird or between a cat and a dog, right? And how we categorize things. So through this really simple mechanism of associative learning, when it happens on a really big scale with a lot of inputs and outputs, it starts to turn into pattern detection and language production and object recognition and some of these really sophisticated things that we do. Now, one of the big unanswered questions is, how far does this scale up, right? Is this really what is going on when we create art, when we think about ethics, when we engage in engineering and building and creativity? Or is there something else, right? Is there some additional layer of something that we have to add on to turn perceptual and statistical learning into some of these bigger processes? We don't know, right? There might well be something else, but we don't know what that thing is, right? We understand the simple processes, and then it starts to get complicated, and we're not sure. So a little bit more about associative learning. I'm going to have you guys help me out for a minute. You're going to have to open your chats, and I'm going to open my chat so that I can see, oh no, so that I can see what you're doing. I didn't mean to do that. All right. Does everyone have your chat open? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to click on the words of a sentence, and your job, even though I gave you a cheat look at what you were going to see, but you probably didn't know what you were looking at. So we'll try it anyway. Your job is to complete a sentence. Okay. So we're going to get it started. We need to leave in a minute. Please put on your socks and really quickly, as fast as you possibly can, type in the chat. Whoa, good job, you guys. All right. Amazing. I just saw like 500 shoes appear with a couple jackets and Crocs. Very cool. Okay. So you guys are outstanding prediction machines. Okay. You just demonstrated how well you were able to predict what was going to finish that sentence. Universally, everyone is happy to put on their socks and shoes. Look at that. Okay. So what we just saw were those extremely strong synaptic connections, right? Where I activated a bunch of input neurons saying, we need to put on your socks, and And those input neurons were activating your associated output neuron saying shoes, right? No problem. Did any of you, oops, that wasn't supposed to come up at the same time, type in codpiece? I don't think so. I'm going to look back through the chat. No, you know, it's a perfectly grammatical, semantically appropriate way to end the sentence, right? You could have said, please put on your socks and codpiece. But that association is just not as strong, right? You have learned over time that this is a far less statistically probable outcome after saying put on your socks and so everyone replied shoes and not codpiece. Okay, we're going to do one more example, and that's what appeared just here. Okay, I'm not feeling very well. I think it's a flu. All I want to do right now is go home, cuddle up with a blanket or a cat, and watch a movie. Maybe I'll have something warm to eat. Okay, I hope your chats are still open. If they aren't, take just a minute to open them again. So I'm going to have something warm to eat. Now, I'm going to show you 2 letters with 2 blanks. And I'm going to ask you again as fast as you can to think of a word that uses those 2 letters by filling in 2 letters in the blanks. Okay, so you've got 2 of the 4 letters given to you, and you have to come up with a word by filling in the 2 blanks that makes a real word. And type it in as fast as you can. What word can it be? Ready. Type in the word. Yeah, look at you go. Okay. You guys are awesome. I'm seeing like 500 soups coming up on my chat. Everyone seeing that? Soup, 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 soup. Nicely done. Okay. Soup it is. But you know what? There are a lot of words that you could have filled in, right? You could have said soap or slap or slip or seep or step or stop, right? There's so many possibilities. But everyone was thinking soup because we were just talking about not feeling well and wanting to be warm. And so all of those inputs were activating this idea. This is called priming. And so everyone almost said soup. There were a couple stops in there because you were like, no, please stop. Please, I can't take it anymore. Okay, most of it was soup though. Nicely done. Both of those are illustrations of associative learning, right? All we're doing are learning to make predictions based on the probabilities of 2 things having co-occurred in the past. You've associated them, and now they come out. Now, click. Okay, how do we go about doing this? In humans and in non-human animals of many sorts that I've showed you, we use a process called error correction. How does error correction work? It starts with an input, right? We have a sensory input. Some kind of stimulus comes in, we perceive it. As an example, we might smell chocolate. Right? That smells really good. I love the smell of chocolate. What comes next? Those sensory neurons bring in the input, activate an associated output, right? In the case of chocolate, I will put this in my mouth and eat it, right? Chocolate is so good, I smell it, I must consume the chocolate, right? That makes sense. It's a strong association. It's like soup, right? If that output is correct, right, it turns out to be a delicious chocolate truffle, I put it in my mouth, wow, that was good, right? The association is strengthened. And I'm more likely to do the same thing again next time, right? I smell chocolate again, and I'm going to put it in my mouth and eat it, even with an even higher probability. But sometimes the output is incorrect, right? I do the wrong thing in response to that stimulus, and then the association is weakened, and we create a new one instead. Like, oh no, that was a mistake. And so to illustrate this, we have our YouTube friend here, this poor little kid who is going through error correction.
Will not stop insisting.
He really wants to eat some cocoa powder.
Does not want to listen.
Right, okay. So we're going to talk in a moment about agency. And so you can think about this child's agency, and like Pinocchio, he's not listening to his mom at all. He has to try it out for himself. It smells so good. But boy, was that a mistake.
Let's put it out. Come on, go for the sink.
Yeah. Okay, so that illustrates to me so nicely this, this process of error correction, right? So now, the next time the kid smells chocolate, he might check the label and see if it's actually cocoa powder, right? And if so, he's not gonna put it in his mouth to eat it. Okay. All right. So what do error correction and associative learning have with AI? Actually, that's quite straightforward. That's pretty much what AI systems do, right? The very foundation of what our brains do to form associations, to make predictions, to change them, to update them and behave appropriately in the world. That's what people have programmed into artificial intelligence systems, at least in the last 50 years, right? Since they figured out that that was a good way to do it. And it works basically the same way, right? So the foundations of intelligence really are simple, right? Our brains are complicated. I'm not arguing that, right? We've got 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses, and it's mind-bogglingly complex. But those same processes happen in the brains of worms, snails, honeybees, fish, right? And the processes themselves aren't that complicated. It's sort of a matter of scale as it gets complicated, right? So these basic predictive learning processes aren't very hard to implement. And AI uses error correction models. You can see a little network here that illustrates, right? Those nodes are like our neurons, and they all connect to each other, and it uses associations between the nodes and the strengths of associations to decide what output is appropriate given a particular input. It basically looks like the same kind of stuff that we're doing. And it's not that hard to tell a computer to do that. But it doesn't quite scale up, right? So it's not hard to put those fundamentals in, but it's hard to reach the level of complexity that our brains have reached. And so for the sake of context, the picture that I have up here, you might not have noticed it or have been able to tell what it is. That's actually a little worm whose entire set of neurons has been mapped. So this worm is simple enough that it has fewer than 1,000 neurons, and people have actually figured out where they all are and how they all connect to each other. And there's a project that you can log into and help out with if you want to, called openworm.org. And scientists are super excited about being able to create a virtual worm, right? As in, this is a hard task and they only have like 300 neurons and we're not there yet, right? So the idea of actually creating a model of a human-like brain is so far beyond our capacity at this point. We're really like struggling to put together this worm with fewer than 1,000 synapses. But it'll be here soon, and it's pretty amazing, actually. So go to that website sometime and check it out. It's hard to get too excited about a worm, but this website will make you do it. So check out openworm.org. Okay, so given that the fundamentals really are the same or similar, what is the difference? Is it just scale? Is it just that, you know, human brains have 100 trillion connections and AI brains don't? That would be an easy thing to fix, right? AI is scaling up so fast that they can easily have more connections than we have, you know, probably in the next 5 years. Is that really the only difference between us? Is it just our neurons are squishy and theirs aren't, right? They've got digital neurons and we've got these like mushy biological ones made of fats. And does that actually mean anything important for the way that we think? Is it the wiring diagram itself, right? Are there specific connections that have to be pre-implemented to make things work the way they're going to work? Or what? So I'm going to look at just a couple differences, possible differences, and then not give you an answer. But to help look at these differences, we're also going to consider Walter. All right, so Walter is our fish here. Walter, unlike me or my kids or you or any artificial intelligence system, survived on his own from the day that he hatched. There's definitely a kind of intelligence to that, right? Being able to just appear in the world and survive and do everything you need to do and eventually reproduce yourself. There's something pretty intelligent looking in the ability to do that, right? He can seek out what he needs to survive. He can find food. He can avoid predators. He can find a mate. He can reproduce. He has the genetic knowledge to create a whole new Walter, right? And release it in the world, and it will survive on its own from the day it hatches. He can recognize familiar objects. He can learn from experience. He can detect probabilistic patterns, right? He can do associative learning and error correction just the way we can. So why is it that you can write an essay on AI and humanity, but Walter can't? Is it just scale? Is it just because your brain is bigger and you have more neurons? It's the same question that I just asked you about AI, and the answer is the same. We don't actually know, right? We don't know what's different about the human brain, except that it's just bigger and more complicated. Is that enough? Okay, so we're going to do a quick comparison of how this learning process works, right? So starting with input, you and Walter share some important attributes. These specific numbers refer to humans, but they apply to actually most human and non-human animals. So you've got a whole bunch of photoreceptors, right? We have about 200 million some, but other species might have more or not quite so many, but millions of photoreceptors. You've got 31,000 auditory receptors, 15 million olfactory receptors, 100,000 taste receptors, 5 million touch receptors, internally sensory receptors regarding like what your muscles and digestion are doing and your water and all this stuff. Every second of every day, even smaller, right? By the millisecond, every millisecond, all of these receptors are just sending information into this network that is your brain. Not just you, Walter's is doing the same thing, right? And your dogs and an elephant, right? Any animal has this constant flow of sensory information coming in. And there's an active process of filtering and attending to this information, right? You're picking which information gets more processing time and which information gets less. You're seeking out what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to, what's important and what isn't important. And you have to, because this is just way too much information to do anything with unless you can filter and attend and decide what is a priority. It's coming in all of these different modalities at once, right? You're getting stuff from your visual system at the same time as hearing, right? You're hearing things, you're tasting things, you're getting all of this together and you're integrating it in real time. In contrast, AI gets a truckload of training stimuli, right? Sometimes it's scraped from the internet, like, library archives, like, language models are doing now. Very often it has to be coded and labeled by humans, right? So a person has to go in and take 1 million photos and label all those photos, like this is a tree, this is a cat, this is a tree, right? And then feed all of that into the system already with a human having had to do the categorization for it so that it can learn, right? So there are actually millions of people with jobs right now that are like labeling pictures to feed into AI to train those AI systems. So the input is really controlled by humans. Humans label it, code it, get it ready, tell AI, this is what you need to learn from, this is what you need to pay attention to. And as Dr. Wenzel was saying before with her learning about brainwaves, it takes hours of training for a really specific problem, right? So you might give it 1 million pictures of different elbows that some human had to go in and be like, this is the elbow, this is the elbow, that's the elbow. And then after all of this time, it will learn to identify what an elbow is. And without that, it struggles to learn these things very well. So if you think about those images that you have to do to prove to a website that you're not a robot, right? Like label all of the crosswalks or label all of the traffic lights. These are things that we have no problem with, but that artificial intelligence often struggles with. So humans have to do it to train them. And then learning depends on feedback, right? So we have these inputs, they activate outputs. Feedback comes back around to say, yes, that was right. Or in the case of our kid with the cocoa powder, like, no, that was the wrong choice. And again, in the case of humans, fish, dogs, cats, elephants, often the feedback comes from the environment itself, right? Sometimes there's no explicit feedback. It's either just you make a prediction and then what you see matches that prediction or doesn't match that prediction, right? I think that when I let go of this ball, it's going to fall. I let go of the ball and it does or doesn't fall and it matches my prediction or it doesn't. Often the feedback is survival related, right? So feedback comes in the form of something that tastes good or tastes bad, in the form of social approval, right? Someone giving you a hug or saying good job, feeling well or not feeling well, like warmth, comfort, safety. These are the kinds of feedback that we often get from the world. In a social species like us, a lot of the feedback comes from parenting and social interactions as well. So we were making fun of that poor AI system who had to take 16 whole hours, right, of like learning about brainwaves in order to be able to figure out what this person was thinking. I will now remind you that like it took the entire first year of your life, every second of every day to figure out what your toes were, right? So when we're infants, we also learned very slowly. So there's something a little bit unfair in holding AI to our adult standards, right? During infancy, how many of those alphabet books did your parents read you before you figured out the letter A? So we get a lot of feedback from our parenting and our social group, but we also have curiosity, right? Just novel input can be rewarding on its own. We can seek out novelty. Again, in contrast, we have bots that need human trainers, right? It's a human trainer that either provides the correct answer or provides a program telling it what counts as a correct answer, right? You might have to program in, if you see this, that's right. And if you see that, then that's not right. But it still takes human programming and input to tell it what is or is not correct. There's very little capacity. I mean, people are trying to make systems that work, that train themselves, right? Self-training systems. It's still not all that effective yet, right? There's not a great capacity to produce useful, meaningful outputs without explicit human-generated or programmed feedback. And finally, I was jotting down notes to myself about Pinocchio when this came up, because one of the big differences between current AI and between humans is agency or self-direction, right? From the time we are small, from the time Walter hatched out of his egg, we were motivated to seek out particular sensory inputs, right? We find them, things that signal food, comfort, safety, mates, curiosity, things that are interesting. We look for specific kinds of input without being told what to look for. In fact, as children, we often, if we're told what to look for, then we want to look for something else, right? We've got that much agency. And we can independently prioritize what inputs to look for, right? So normally we might look for food, but if we're injured, maybe we prioritize that less. Normally we want to avoid predators and stay safe, but if we're starving, we prioritize safety less, right? We can adjust those priorities, again, without necessarily being told explicitly to do so, right? That's just something that we figure out. We can identify problems, right? AI is typically told, here is the problem that you need to solve. We find problems, right? We identify them, we search for inconsistencies, and then decide which ones are the interesting or uninteresting ones, right? If we see a new pattern, is this worth looking more closely into or not? Now, agency in this sense is something we share with most other animals on the planet, right? We might have our own unique brand of agency, but even a fish can seek out relevant inputs, prioritize which ones it needs, identify when something is amiss, and search for more information about it. This isn't uniquely human. This is sort of part of being an evolved biological being. For the most part, AI systems can't do this. This is something, again, that programmers are working on. They're brainstorming ways to make this effective, to implement it, but it's not really there yet. Okay, so just briefly in a nutshell, we're going to compare. We've got a bot here, digital neurons. The scale is approaching human scale. Google Brain has about 100 billion digital neurons, which is about how many human neurons there are. Whether it has as many synaptic connections is less clear, but it'll get there. I'm confident it'll get there. But its motivation is human defined and narrow. Its training is extensive. It doesn't really have agency or attention, right? These are things people are working on. Walter has squishy neurons, a much smaller scale, but does have motivation to survive, to find things important for survival. Takes little training. I love to tell my students that I can train fish to do tasks in fewer trials than I can train human college students to do tasks. They learn faster. they're super quick. They do have agency in the sense that I'm using it, and they may actually have attention as well. And then we have humans who share with the fish squishy neurons, but we have a huge scale, right? Our brains are much bigger. We have survival motivation, plus maybe something else. This is something you can think about for discussion, right? Do we have something more? I call our training brief in quotation marks because it took a while, you know, when we were infants to get the system up and running, but now it's pretty fast. And we clearly do have agency and attention. So these are the mechanisms. This is like the structure of these three systems that we're comparing. What are the outputs then? Well, a bot, as Dr. Devadas was talking about last week, they're very good at math, right? They can do a lot of fancy calculations and demonstrate that theorems are true. I'm going to say, actually, artistically, I've not been that impressed, but, you know, they can make things that exceed my own personal capabilities. So I don't want to trash talk them too much. So, you know, art is not so bad. Although apparently they're not very good at identifying crosswalks. We give them no moral standing at this point. And do they have sentience? We don't know. I'll ask you that later. Walter, not much, not great in the mathematical area, not so great at art, could probably identify crosswalks, right? We could train a fish to pass that, like, are you a bot test? Also has no moral standing, probably not sentient, but again, that's a question for debate. And then we have humans. Math, it varies quite a bit. Math and art both, right? Better than Walter, whether we're better than the bot, hard to say, but we're really good at identifying crosswalks. And we do like to grant ourselves sole moral standing in the world, and for the most part, we're sentient. So there are some differences here, but overall, where does this picture leave us? In a kind of uncomfortable place, I would say. So on one hand, there are a lot of things that make us different from AI, right? But a lot of those things we actually share with our neighborhood snails, right? So do we want to really say, like, this is what's special about us humans? We're not like machines in this way, but we are like snails, right? Is that really fancy and unique? So we have squishy neurons, we have multimodal sensory inputs from all of these different sensory systems. We have evolved motivational systems, agency or self-direction. Bots don't have those, like, so they're bots, but, you know, Walter does. And then on the other hand, there are features that make us different from other species, like our ability to create complex grammatical sentences, to produce art, to solve mathematical problems. Yeah, Walter can't do those, but our AI systems can. So where does that leave us, right? It leaves us grappling with the question that we started asking 3,000 years ago, which is, what is it about humans actually that's special? We've been asking this in comparison to animals for as long as I can remember, longer than I can remember. That's ridiculous, right? For hundreds of years. AI really just kind of gives us a new tool to ask this question, but not necessarily any answers. So we're not going to discuss these final questions now because we have no time, but we might bring them back up later this afternoon. So as you think about what we are, what makes us humans, and as we talk later, we might go over things like how important is it to have neurons that aren't digital, to have an evolved motivational system? How important is agency? Is that something we want AI to have, or is that something we don't want it to have? Do we actually want AI to mimic us closely? Some of the good things that we do, like helping and empathy, probably come from our evolutionary, evolved motivational systems. But then so do some of the undesirable biases like racism and irrational behaviors. Do we want those to be present in an AI system? No, not the bad ones, but yes, the good ones. Can we have it both ways? And how do we go about claiming moral superiority when we're being now outdone on a lot of the tasks that made us morally superior? So I will have no answers for you, but I invite you to come to our discussion later and answer them for me. So thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you, Dr. Blazer. That was so fascinating. And I'm already seeing so many cool overarching themes between all the talks in terms of capabilities and agency and non-human versus human. So hopefully you all are having some good food for thought. So we now have our final presenter, Dr. Hasselback, who will close us out, and then we will move on to our Q&A.
Hi, thank you. And thank you so much to my colleagues. I love doing this. This is my second summer doing it, and I always learn so much. That was really fascinating. I think actually I'm glad to be following Dr. Blazer, because a lot of those questions at the very end are ones that I would like to ask too, not necessarily as they relate directly to AI, but to technology more generally, social media, how technology and our confrontation with it changes us, what it's capable of, but also then what we're capable of as we change along with these emerging technologies. Okay, so I hope you all were able to watch Nosedive, the episode of Black Mirror. And I hope also that some of you have seen Black Mirror before. It is a fascinating series. It's been along for a while, over 10 years now. They just recently released the last season of it. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm really intrigued by it. It gives you so much to think about. It is a very, just as a warning, Nosedive was actually not as uncomfortable as some of them can be. It can be a very deeply troubling series, but one that gets us thinking. This is why I love it so much. So my talk today is entitled Social Media, Identity, and Black Mirror. My name is Professor Hasselback. I teach in the English department, and I'm also the director of the Writing Center. I say that because I hope that, I know you're all coming into USC. I really hope you come by and see us and use us as a resource. You can ask me about that anytime. I would love to talk about that. Okay, so onward. Just, before getting started, I know you're like hearing from a lot of different disciplines. I just wanted to give you a little sense of what literary analysis and the discipline of English does. I know many of you have taken English classes, of course, in high school, but it is a bit different in college. And I did feel like I needed to qualify why I am an English professor teaching an episode of Black Mirror. So I'll do that at the very end here. But just generally, the question here, what do studies in literature afford? It hones your skills of sensitive reading, critical thinking, and persuasive writing. These are skills that will benefit you in any job, no matter what you go into. And this is why I believe a liberal arts education is just so valuable. It just benefits you professionally, but just also in your lives as you develop as a person. These are skills that will help you grow. Politics, religion, and philosophy live in language and discourse. Language is power, right? Toni Morrison said that when she was a little girl, she got a hold of some sidewalk chalk with her sister, and she wrote the letter F, and then they wrote the letter U, and her mother came out screaming. And she said, I didn't even know what that word was. I saw it somewhere. It seemed shocking. We were just going to reproduce it. We didn't even know what it was. But that is when I learned, age 4, age 5 is when I learned that language has power, right? So you should be able to have some facility with it, right? Next up, reading stories told from different perspectives can help us to understand the varied voices and experiences that constitute our communities, various communities, and our world more generally. And then literature offers a space to engage with and explain the world as well as your place in it. And as an academic discipline, the field of contemporary literary studies relies on the idea that narratives, stories, right, art, reflect our world as well as our understanding of it. And this is the important part, I think. These narratives can also inspire us to shape and change that understanding, right? So we're not reading in a vacuum. Stories are not written in a vacuum, right? We're given messages and information to apply to ourselves and outside of ourselves. And then so finally here, you know, why are we talking about a television series in the discipline of English? So just to qualify that a little bit, literary analysis can be performed in lots of different genres. You see performance theory as related to literary analysis, drama, religious and historical texts. I focus on a lot of visual art along with texts. William Blake, whose art I have here on the side of this slide, his visual art and the poetry he wrote, you know, inseparable, undivorceable from each other, right? You cannot understand the text without understanding the art with it, and vice versa, right? And so a rich series, I'm saying, like Black Mirror, offers a screenplay alongside other tonal features that combine to generate narrative and social commentary. So we're just analyzing features of something like we would analyze motifs in a text, right? Okay, so Black Mirror, moving on. For those of you who are not familiar with the series more generally, it was created by someone named Charlie Brooker. He wrote most of the episodes. He was one of the writers on Nosedive, but he wasn't the primary one. That was shared by Michael Schur and Rashida Jones. You might be familiar with Michael Schur as the producer, creator of The American Office, The Good Place, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, gosh, there are others I'm missing, but Parks and Rec, really, you know, feel good kinds of shows. And it's interesting to think about this alongside those and think about what his priorities and values are in each. And Rashida Jones, of course, starred in both The Office and Parks and Rec, and she herself is also a writer. 6 seasons in total, but they're British seasons, so they're quite short. We only have a total of 29 episodes in those 6 seasons. It's an anthology series, so that means there are different characters and different stories every time. I actually almost didn't watch this series because I thought episode 1 of season 1 was like, it's not the best, I think. And so I would say if you hit one that doesn't really do it for you, then keep trying with it. It offers a lot to you. And if you don't like a story or a lesson or whatever, you might like the next one. The genre is manifold. They're calling it science fiction, dystopian fiction, speculative fiction. I really quite like speculative fiction as a way of identifying this, because it has so much figurative language, metaphors, the active displacement, allegorical components, and those offer a fruitful landscape for calibrating and defining our relationship to complex social issues. And Black Mirror in particular, these episodes are concerned specifically with the confrontation between humanity and technology. This is not new, of course, and I'm thinking not even new in literature. Mary Shelley, likely wrote one of the first English language science fiction novels with Frankenstein, which was, of course, not about how it's bad to use technology, but how it's bad to be a bad person in your use of technology. How do you treat people as you're using technology? And I think that's the spirit of Black Mirror as well. So on to Nosedive. I actually have, this is just a 1-minute clip. I'd like for you to see Charlie Brooker talking about it. I had wanted to show you a couple of very quick scenes, but Netflix has disabled the ability for you to over Zoom show content. So I can't do that, but I do believe this will work. So I'm going to stop my share for a moment and just switch over to, I think, can I do it here? Let me see. Hopefully, oh, sorry, that's just Blake. Can you see Charlie Brooker now, his face? I hope that's true. Okay. This is, again, 58 seconds. I'll just play it. He's describing, what he was after in the making of this episode. So, all right, here we go. Oh, shoot. Sorry, one sec. Sorry, I think I need to turn the volume up. Okay. I do think there is an irony in my inability to use technology as I talk about our human confrontation with technology, but all right, here goes.
Nosedive. Nosedive is a satire on acceptance and the image of ourselves we like to portray and project to others. It stars Bryce Dallas Howard, who's fantastic, and she's playing a character called Lacey, who lives her life trying to please everyone.
Lacey is lost. She's lost herself in this world where she thinks that her value is equivalent to her points.
Who starts? Who starts?
Wasn't a meaningful encounter.
Everyone is a little bit heightened and false because everyone's terrified of being marked down because the consequences of that are unpleasant. So it's basically the world we live in.
Okay, so that was just a little taste of Charlie Brooker, as well as Nosedive. And I wanted you to see actually just some of the aesthetics again, because they're quite striking in this. We'll get to that in a moment. But so just for those of you who watched this a while ago, or maybe didn't have a chance to, Lacey featured here is the episode's protagonist. She lives in kind of a parallel version of the US, maybe a bit in the future because they have this new technology, where interactions are ranked through an app that loads information through some kind of retinal or ocular implants. Everyone's rating is accessible immediately. So the first thing you do is to think of someone as they are filtered through that rating, right? It conditions people to think of the interaction in terms of who they're interacting with, right? And what rating they have. And the social consequence of this is, I say here, a pastel hellscape of fake cheer and goodwill. It's interesting, the aesthetics really, really clash with the, kind of grim content that underlies this whole episode. The softness, the lack of edge is it's just like everyone's brimming with some kind of untold anger, I think. Okay, so when Lacey is told that she cannot afford to move to a certain neighborhood, her dream home, and it's implied her dream life along with that, a relationship she'll get, she tries to qualify for a program that will give her a discount if she can raise her rating. This is possible, but very difficult for her. So she meets with this social media coach named Hanson. He says, and I think this is really telling of this world and what, everyone's doing. So in terms of quality, you could use a punch up right here, right there. Ideally, that's votes from quality people. We should all be pausing at that phrase, quality. What's a quality person? Who's not a quality person, right? If there is a quality person, is there someone who's not? And Lacey echoes this innocently, quality people. What do you mean? What does that mean, right? Who are we in this world of, heightened technology? So to this end, she embarks on a trying journey to attend an old friend's wedding where she hopes to receive praise from prime influencers. We see a lot of influencers now. I think this came out a while ago, and influencers are even more important now, or maybe more visible. In fact, I ask students sometimes like what their ideal job is, their dream job, and a lot of them say influencer. She hopes they will rate her speech. As the episode's title suggests, however, nosedive, plummet. This journey involves a series of blows to both Lacey's rank and her mental stability, although in the end, arguably, it does free her in a sense. We'll talk, hopefully those of you who I can talk to in the discussion section will talk about whether this was hopeful or not. So one thing I wanted to note, just in terms of, performing some kind of analysis of a text of some kind, is if there's any kind of aesthetic component, it's worth looking at that, right? So in the movie Get Out, for example, there's a party scene. It's a troubling party, and all the people who are like making people uncomfortable are wearing black, white, and red. So that's an aesthetic choice, right? So here, we get this world of pastels. They're Instagram friendly colors. I say this as an old person who's not on Instagram, so I don't even know, but I hear this is like the colors should be kind of neutral and not punchy, nothing bold, no Frida Kahlo, right? No like red hearts, things like that. Yet the ending, which you see on the bottom right here, is monochromatic and sterile. So this is when Lacey ends up in jail at the very end. She meets a kindred spirit, I would say, and the color is just vacuumed out of this world. We have sharp edges finally in this other world where Lacey came from. Of all the rankings, everything is in this kind of pastel. The clash of the aesthetic beauty, I'd say one vision of beauty, right? Because this isn't Frida Kahlo kind of beauty, but and the painful content, I'd say, is evocative of the film Midsummer, if anyone's seen that. It's very, very upsetting, like big content warning. It's a horror movie, and it is indeed horrible, but it's fascinating. And it has these bright, gorgeous Scandinavian, like May Day scenes of flowers and natural beauty, all this green all around. The skies are phenomenal, right? And the content is horrifying, right? And so same here, but just, a different kind of aesthetic, a different kind of clash with the content. And I say here, the artificiality here in this episode is evocative of Barbie. I'm Barbie on the brain with Barbie coming out now. I haven't seen it yet. I'm really excited to, and I know it's billed as something for people who love or hate Barbie. So that's a curious place to be, I think. But old school Barbie, the kind of fake, like idealized vision of what someone should look like or what a world should look like, right? Lacey practicing her smile. It's like painful to watch that for your own real person face. There's just one singular vision of perfection in this world, right? And so I'm saying here, what's missing? What are we not getting in this world? A sense of reality, right? A complication, gray areas, edginess, art. We don't get anything outside of this kind of uniform, singular vision, right? Where's the art? Art gives us possibility, right? Passion. We don't get any of these emotions. I mentioned anger before. That's one I focus on a lot for this episode, but we don't get anger. We don't get frustration, except when Lacey is unable to hold these emotions in anymore. Regret, right? These are deeply important to the human experience, but this valence of technological ranking is suppressing some of that, which some of us might think is, necessary to realize a vision of humanity, and individualism, which is, I think, very important. Hopefully you think that too. Maybe that's something we can talk about as well. But everything looks the same. Everyone speaks in the same kind of way. Everything is the same. So the social commentary that we get from this, and this is just a snapshot of it. I'm sure there's a lot more, but these are some of the things that I think are really interesting. I think the real hero of this is anger. I think it's the missing protagonist in this episode, and we get flashes of it when Lacey just breaks slowly, sometimes slowly, bit by bit, and then at the very end, she breaks, gloriously in the jail and at the wedding when she's giving her speech. She starts to fail in this twisted society when she gets angry at the airport. And that's a complicated scene because there is so much cruelty that's, directed toward people who work in the service industry. And that was an uncomfortable scene because she wasn't right to take it out on that woman at the airport, but she wasn't angry at that woman. She was angry at the system that's not allowing her to get a flight because her ranking is too low, because she got in a fight with her brother, right? And she's in this world where she's not allowed to be frustrated. Imagine a world where you can't grieve for something, right? Or be upset about something. Be extremely enthusiastic about something in some real, genuine way, right? So here I'm saying anger is linked in the episode to moments of honesty and righteous frustration. In the end, her angry rant in the prison is really cathartic, I think, for a lot of us. This is a question I have. Did you think that ending was hopeful or not? Let's talk about that. And then some of the social issues that I think Brooker and Michael Schur and Rashida Jones are tackling here. Ratings and social repercussions. We have, as he said, this is basically our world. We have versions of this operating already. Lacey works with someone whose job is in jeopardy because everyone in the office has sided with his boyfriend during a breakup, right? And he's not even allowed in the building anymore by the end. Housing is linked to this kind of rating system. We see that in, credit scores today and people's ability to access, places to live in neighborhoods based on what they can afford. And what they can afford is based on, these ratings that they, at this point, people, you share your credit rating willingly, but who knows if that will always be the case, right? And then just general resource accessibility, right? Susan, this was one of, I think, the most touching parts of the episode, but Susan's husband, that Susan is the trucker who gives Lacey a ride. Her husband is not able to receive a clinical trial for his cancer because he was ranked lower than someone else. And we see, advantages in healthcare happening all the time to people who are wealthier, right? This is, I mean, COVID kind of gave us this information head on if you didn't know this already. And something else that I think is really interesting about this is kind of the gender commentary. This is not as overt, but Susan, the trucker, I think is painted as this social outcast. And indeed, the aesthetics follow that too. When we see scenes of the truck, they're very dark. You can almost just make out her face, right? And Lacey's face when they're in the truck together. Whereas at the wedding, at, you know, Lacey's work, in her home, you see all these pastel colors, right? She's a social outcast. Her life is lived off the grid. She says she prefers this, right? I believe her, but it seems like she doesn't have an option to come back if she wanted to. While Lacey's brother, also really low rank, right? He has diminished options, of course, because of his rank, but he can still kind of course through mainstream society. He's still living with Lacey. He's still able to do some things. He has friends. And indeed, I'm saying here, he even comes across as kind of cool and alternative for it. And so that was just one example of how a woman has all of this added pressure to be like all or nothing, right? Versus this man who's not quite the all and not quite the nothing, but he has the privilege of inhabiting this kind of middle ground. And this is just the conversation between Ryan and Lacey when she's talking about how she wants to move to this neighborhood. He says, Pelican Cove, what is this? A eugenics program? What, everyone looks the same? Are they like genetically engineering people to be the same, right? Lacey says, a lifestyle community. And he says, no one is this happy. A 2-year-old with an effing balloon isn't this happy, right? So he seems cool, right? And Susan seems cool, but no one in society views her that way, right? Lacey's brother could still be appealing. So I thought those were just some interesting social commentaries that came through in the episode. Of course, there are more. One thing, you know, I'm talking about anger and what's missing here. We don't get this glorious red of, in this painting by Frida Kahlo, we don't get the brokenness, right? We don't get a sense of frustration and despair and regret, right? So that's, I don't want to live in a world without Frida Kahlo's paintings and emotions and aesthetics, right? And so I think Brooker is asking us how we feel about that. So then finally bringing us to, I think, like Dr. Blazer, maybe asking more questions than answering them, which is maddeningly what the discipline of English often does. It's more about kind of asking and finding your way into something rather than having kind of easy to digest takeaway nuggets. What can we learn from this episode about not how to avoid technology, following Mary Shelley's lead in Frankenstein, but how to use it responsibly? This rating system world, right? If this is some version of a reality for us or where we're headed, how can we think about putting mechanisms in place to stave off some of the more dire consequences, right? Is part of being human, being honest with ourselves. Honesty is missing, right? With each other. How is social media to be navigated honestly? Is that a platform for honesty? Is it something else, right? Is anger necessarily a part of being honest? I'm saying here, change takes critical thinking. This is why I'm saying, you know, I think being able to read and think about your situation is so important. And sometimes that involves getting angry. You learn about, you know, inequalities. There's an anger in that, right? And I want to leave you instead of with, you know, a tidy parting nugget, just this dialogue between Lacey and herself, really, as she's delivering her speech at the wedding. She's talking about her old friendship with her very, very superficial friend, the highly rated, you know, high influencer, quality person, right? And she says, we talk about all the things girls talk about, you know, boys, hair, products, more boys, nervous laugh. Her nervous laugh is like hard to watch, right? And then she says, because she's breaking now, she's angry now. I mean, I tried sometimes to expand our range a little and talk about climate change, but she found that kind of boring. So go on. She was probably right. I mean, F the planet, right? So anyway, I guess I'm hoping you'll come away thinking about not just what is technology capable of, what is AI capable of, social media, all the platforms we use, but what are we capable of and what do we want to be in relation to those technologies? And how do we kind of self-interrogate and shape ourselves and our world in a way that we're honest about? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.